And I'm also mindful of the fact that Justice Rehnquist, Chief Justice Rehnquist, not that many years ago, pulled together, I believe, 9 former clerks in Washington for a gathering. And we're thrilled that he'll be back in this area next May. And that also to be reminded that were it not for Phil Neal introducing Mr. Rehnquist to Justice Jackson, he would not have become clerk of the Supreme Court, nor Chief Justice of the Court. But that's just a little footnote. Important to remember. Introductions are important. I remember the time when Mario Cuomo was being introduced by the senior senator from New York to President Ronald Reagan. He was making the introduction. Mr. President, I'd like to present to you. He's about to say Mario Cuomo. He says, "You don't have to tell me, Lee Iacocca." But Helen and I are pleased to welcome each of you here tonight. We're part of a gathering band of witnesses to the memory, integrity, and leadership of Justice Jackson. I'm also pleased to have his granddaughter. And because Justice Jackson left an indelible imprint on the processes of justice at the close of World War II with the trial of the Nazis at Nuremberg. And as Greg mentioned, in this very room a year ago, we celebrated 4 close colleagues of Justice Jackson and heard from Whitney Harris following another full day of events. It was a great evening. And all 4 were dutifully and respectfully recorded by Greg Peterson and his colleagues, like the trio here this evening, and are part of an effort to catch the full spectrum of Justice Jackson's legal scholarship and opinions and explore how they are a counterweight to the conflict and belligerency which besets our times. Helen and I also recall, with fond memories, Werner von Rosenstiel. This man turned out to have such an energy level, it reminded me of Stanley Kunitz, our poet laureate of 96 years, who was the biggest hit in the summer of 2001 here, taking 7 events in one day. But Werner von Rosenstiel has written an amazing book, and he got across the essential story of his life under the attentive patronage and encouragement of Greg and his colleagues. But we were thrilled to host that evening in our home. We had a few people here who were with us on that occasion. And then, a couple of weeks ago, just 3 weeks ago, to have Fred Korematsu here with his wife. And I think Fred might not have made it without the encouragement of that wife. How often can we tell that story? The subject of an award-winning documentary that had just gotten a couple of Emmys the week before, who stood up at the time of the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II, and who really wanted to serve in our armed services. And his appeal to the Supreme Court was defeated 6-3, with Jackson writing the dissenting opinion. And indeed, John Q. Barrett beautifully summed up Jackson's principal 3 arguments, which had an influence on events to come. I mean, how these things come together and the run they have. And after 40 years, finally, in 1983, Korematsu was exonerated of the felony and later given the President's Medal of Freedom, which puts him in the category of the quotidian hero, the everyday hero, just as Rosa Parks took her stand, or her seat, on the bus in her day. I understand you've had a splendid session today of reflections by these 3 noteworthy and esteemed lawyers. And again, on behalf of the Chautauqua Institution, I'm delighted to welcome you for the closing banquet of a day of feasts. Thank you.
few more introductions, since that seems to be the thing. We are privileged to have in our midst the family of Robert H. Jackson and Julia Craighill, the granddaughter of Robert H. Jackson. Julia, if you please stand. Came up from Virginia this morning, and the grandson, Tom Loftus, who similarly came up from Virginia. Tom? And Harold Adams, the nephew of Robert Jackson. Harold, who gave us a tour today for his birthday. Before I call up Raleigh, though, this is not on the program, and since we're talking about introductions, I'm going to ask Phil Neal to come up and to tell a story which he told today about his name is Phil. In case you wonder, you look at it and figure it's a misspelling, but it in fact is Phil. And with that, I'm going to embarrass you and ask you to come up and tell that story because it's apropos.
I'm not sure what it's apropos of, but except for the mistake that was made by some people here calling me Philip, I guess. The story, which some people have found amusing, is that I found myself some years ago on the program of a Seventh Circuit Judicial Conference in Chicago, at which Justice Tom Clark was also speaking, and I know him and had a friendly relationship with him. He preceded me on the program, and toward the end of his speech, right at the end of his speech, he saw me sitting there and made some reference to my friend Phil, and said, "I hope it's all right to refer to the dean by his first name," and then kind of finished his remarks. And I was up and groping for some kind of light remarks to open my talk with. As I walked up, I thought about this, and when I got there, and I said, "Justice Clark, it's perfectly all right for you to call me by my first name. I'm pleased by that, and especially because I've always felt I have a certain kinship with you, and that we both suffered under the burden of having first names that are really nicknames." And I said, "All my life people have been asking me, whatever happened to your hip?" And I guess all your life people have been asking you, whatever happened to your... One of my more successful impudences in the course of my career, and I still meet lawyers who remind me of that event. I repeated it here, and some people seem to like it. Since I'm on my feet, though, I want to take the opportunity to say what a great honor and pleasure it's been to be here for this event, which has given me occasion to recall many things I haven't thought about for years, and really to kind of reflect on what Justice Jackson and what his influence has been on my life, which I think has been one of those things you're not particularly conscious of, but which my wife has kind of brought to my attention as having been a pretty signal influence in the things that I have valued and try to do in my lifetime. So I'm very grateful to the Robert Jackson Center for this opportunity, and I'm tremendously admiring of what is being done by the Robert Jackson Institute and Center, and I guess I can kind of summarize all that by paying great tribute to Greg for what he's done, and so I'd like to end by saluting Greg and the Center and wishing him well.
Thank you.
Well, for lots of reasons, I'm glad I called on Phil Neal. They were clerks for Justice Jackson, which means, of course, he was a justice of the Supreme Court. And to my left, and I look at very admiringly, is two documents. One is the document, the original, of Justice Jackson being commissioned to be a justice of the Supreme Court, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1941. And Karen Livesey and Kristen Stein don't trust me whatsoever in letting this go. And above that is, in fact, a commission authorizing Robert Jackson, Justice Robert Jackson, to be chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials. He had a fancy title there, but it's signed by President Truman. So at the end of today's performance, you feel free to take a look at those, and thanks to Fenton Historical Society for sharing these items as well as the items which are on the entryway. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to call on the guy who makes things happen on a day-to-day basis, the Honorable Roland Kidder. He's the Executive Director of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and we couldn't be happier with the fact of Raleigh being part of us. It just adds a real extra layer of esteem, dignity, integrity. What else did you talk about yourself? Raleigh Kidder. Raleigh?
Well, as you can see, I'm so distinguished that I don't have a boutonniere. My wife saw it after I put it on and said it belongs on me. So Jane has the boutonniere. I wanted to just talk a couple seconds about the mission of the Robert Jackson Center. And of course, we really are trying to advance Jackson's legacy in many areas, particularly in international law. However, if you'll read the mission statement that's in your program, you'll see that the other part of our mission is to try and educate youth on what justice means in today's world. This really came from Carl Kappa, who was one of our founders. When Greg was interviewing Carl one time about his life, Greg asked him a question, well, who did you grow up, who was your role model growing up as a kid in Jamestown? And Greg thought he might say Yogi Berra or some baseball player or something. And he said, my parents told me I should grow up to be like Robert Jackson. And I didn't know Robert Jackson, but I studied him and I know a lot about him. And he said he was the kind of person that I would like to be like. And here's Carl at his age, and Carl, of course, is no longer with us. And Carl made it clear that he wanted kids growing up in Jamestown and in this area to know more about Jackson. And so one of our missions is to advance his legacy not only in the international or national community, but with the kids. And just to give you an idea, next Monday I'll be going to Albany. I'll be going down to the Law, Youth, and Citizenship program that's sponsored by the New York State Bar Association. There'll be at a conference 300 school teachers from across the state, history teachers. I'll be taking with me a Jamestown High School history teacher. And I'll be talking about the Jackson Center and showing our little video, and he will be presenting his lesson plan on Korematsu's visit and how it relates to the rights of the individual versus the power of the government. And we hope that through that event we'll begin to network with schools across this state, with the Bar Association on a regular basis. In our internet connection now, the website that we have, we've spent the money to make it what we think is a world-class website. It's not there yet, but it does have streaming capability. We hope that in a couple of years when we have events like the one we had today, that you'll be able to plug in on your computer and watch it in live time on our website. And these are the kinds of things we're doing to try and get out to the kids in this community. And with that in mind, just let me close with this. Many of you those of you who came from outside of our area to come to this event, we're a Midwestern type of community here. We're a lot like it was when Jackson was here. This area wasn't settled from the east, it was settled from the west. People were on their way west and they filtered back into this area with sort of a backwater, back eddy in America's immigration. The Swedes that came in here were really headed for Minnesota. We got a few of them. But that just gives you an example. And people here have been pretty conservative and pretty rural. We're a small town manufacturing area. And it was the same when Jackson grew up. And yet, Jackson didn't let that deter him from becoming what he became. And that's sort of a subtitle, I think, of what we want to leave with kids as we talk about our mission with them. And just because you're from a place like Jamestown, and sort of in a backwater, it doesn't mean you can't reach your goals. Here's a gentleman who never had the money to go to college. He went to 1 year of law school. And yet he was disciplined, he had values, he stuck to his knitting, and he learned the English language, he mastered it, and he became one of our finest jurists that America's ever produced. So as we head down this road of the Jackson Center, I think that's another story. I've told people that I think Robert Jackson is sort of an Abe Lincoln story of the 20th century. And we want to leave them with that message because there's a lot of kids coming along here that could also do it. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Just looking at this commission again, Karen, Kristen, just want you to know I'm looking at it. And I never noticed, but on the commission for the, this is for what? This is, where is it also? This is the one for the Justice of the Supreme Court. It is countersigned by Acting Attorney General Francis Biddle. Interestingly enough, a few years later, Francis Biddle and Robert Jackson would have some fun together at Nuremberg. And a little bit of serendipity on that document, which would be very nice in my office.
Is that a secure site?
Speaking of Nuremberg, in the preface to the book authored by Eugene Gerhardt called Robert H. Jackson, the Lawyer's Judge, he wrote, Mr. Justice Jackson regarded his work as America's chief prosecutor at the war crimes trial in Nuremberg before the International Military Tribunal as the high point of his legal career. Certainly it was a unique achievement. His work as a Justice of the United States Supreme Court, his task there, as we all know, occupied less than 2 years. However, his work as Justice of the United States Supreme Court spanned the years 1941 to 1954. During that period, he wrote for the court some of its finest opinions. His dissents were incisive. His colleague, Mr. Justice Minton, wrote of Jackson that he had a facility for expression unsurpassed by any man who ever sat on the court. We're thrilled today to be with those clerks who were part of that process, those incisive writings and the inspiration, no doubt, that they all provided. And I have a distinct privilege to introduce at this time Professor John Q. Barrett, who will talk a little bit more about our special guest. A little bit about Professor Barrett, though. John is a professor of law at St. John's University in New York City, where he teaches constitutional law, legal history, criminal procedure, and professional responsibility. He is also the Elizabeth S. Linney Fellow. That was until Joe came into her life.
She's not here, go easy.
Yes, we do have a fellowship, and the first fellowship was, the selection was John Barrett. He currently is editing Justice Jackson's previously unknown intimate memoir of President Franklin Roosevelt. Professor Barrett also is researching and writing a biography of Jackson that will include, hopefully, the first inside account of the year he spent as chief American prosecutor of the principal surviving Nazi leaders before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Before becoming a law professor, Barrett was a prosecutor in the Office of Independent Counsel Lawrence Walsh. It's the Iran-Contra affair. So maybe we can get Professor Barrett and Mies together someday at Chautauqua. And that'd be a wonderful lunch. Yes. Ed spent some time up here. And has also served as counsel to Inspector General Michael Bromwich in the United States Department of Justice from 1994 to 1995. John is a Wisconsin native, go Green Bay, is a graduate of Georgetown University and Harvard Law School, and served for 2 years as a law clerk to Judge A. Higginbotham, Jr., who was the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Philadelphia. He has spoken on a couple of occasions at Chautauqua Institution. Foremost among them was one at the Hall of Philosophy, where he spoke during July of 2001, where he joined that illustrious speaker, Greg Peterson, at the podium. With that, I introduce John Barrett. John?
Thank you, Greg and Raleigh and Scott McVay, friends of the Jackson Center, and all of our guests this evening. I'd like to begin with just one more news announcement. It would be an applause line, but Raleigh and Jane Kidder today became grandparents again, and that deserves note. And I mention that not just because it's special news in and of itself, but because it's family news. And this place, in the life of Robert Jackson, and frankly, as Raleigh mentioned, in its reality today, is still a place of deep, abiding family values. And I don't mean that in any political bumper sticker, partisan sort of way. I mean that in terms of its substance. Raleigh mentioned Jamestown or Chautauqua County as a place that can be viewed as backwater. But frankly, sometimes backwater is deep water. And one of the deepest things I think you can find is the substance that too easily gets glossed in the label of family values. But the substance of it, real engagement on serious matters, close personal relationship, abiding human values are things that were Robert Jackson, but I have come to understand are part of this place. And so the Kidder grandchild and family and Jackson and tonight are really all the same thing. Now, it's my privilege tonight to introduce three members of the Robert H. Jackson family, the Supreme Court family. In the 20th century, it became customary for Supreme Court justices to employ law clerks. It developed in the decades leading up to the 1940s that a secretary, something of a personal assistant, became more and more a law assistant, a young lawyer of exceptional talent who worked with the justice on his, and they were all his work, as the justice obviously defined his job and chose to use his law clerk. Justice Jackson, who joined the Supreme Court in 1941 and then served for a total of 13 years, had 11 law clerks during that time period. He had 12 if you count his own son, who was something of an Uber law clerk, but that's another story. The Jackson law clerks are, to a person, a spectacularly interesting and special group of people. The first of the law clerks, chronologically, John Costello, is no longer with us. Our three guests tonight are law clerks 2, 3, and 4. And what they span is really the bulk of the decade, the 1940s. Just to give you the chronology, Phil Neal was a law clerk beginning in 1943 and served through the spring of 1945. Murray Gartner was a law clerk beginning that spring of 45 and served through the summer of 47. And Jim Marsh was a law clerk beginning in the fall of 47 and serving until the summer of 1949. Robert Jackson, sadly, did not live nearly his due or get to serve us on the court, our due. But in those 13 years, he had a pattern of employing one exceptional law clerk after another. There's a negative implication in what I'm about to say, and I truly don't mean it that way. But I can tell you candidly, before I tell you a detail about any of these gentlemen, that each of them was somebody who was extremely special to Robert Jackson. It's something that he left quite a clear record of in his writings, private, public, correspondence, and so forth. And the process by which he found each of them is a long and interesting and varied story, part of which we covered today in our roundtable. But these were three people in his family, and so they too fit everything that this place stands for. The first law clerk, who you've already met, and so introducing him is a bit of an anticlimax, is Phil Neal. No hip. Phil Neal, a native of Chicago, attended its schools, then became a student at Harvard College, graduated, and after briefly studying economics and recovering from rheumatic fever, I believe, enrolled in Harvard Law School and became a very successful student there. By the time he graduated, he was the president of the Harvard Law Review, which is a tremendous academic honor and really a position of amazing power in the American Legal Academy for a young person to hold. And was then hired by Robert Jackson to be his law clerk beginning in 1943. Phil was with Jackson for those 2 terms. He should have served Jackson until about June of 1945, but Justice Felix Frankfurter, Jackson's colleague and friend and soulmate on the court, took a great interest in young people of promise, and Phil Neal was one of them. And there was a day on which Felix Frankfurter asked Phil Neal, "What are you going to do next?" And Phil, kind of, I think, shrugged and said something about how his health had resulted in him not being eligible for military service during the war. Maybe he could do something during the peace. At which point Frankfurter grabbed him, and it's great. Each of these law clerks has used this phrase separately. Grabbed me by the elbow in that vice-like way that Frankfurter had, grabbing me by the elbow. And marched Phil Neal down to Frankfurter's chambers, picked up the phone, called Alger Hiss over at the State Department and told him, wonderful young man, clerkship ending, serving in the peace, and before you knew it, Phil was in Hiss's office interviewing for something that became the United Nations project. Phil knew that Jackson had already hired a successor law clerk, Murray Gartner, who I'll introduce in a moment. And so Phil, first, maybe by telephone, grabbed Murray by the elbow and made sure Murray was available. And having figured out that they could cover Jackson, went to Jackson and said, "I have an opportunity. Murray can start early if I can go and serve the State Department and be part of this project." And Jackson, with enthusiasm, gave Phil his blessing. And so the clerkship transition occurred. Phil Neal worked at Dumbarton Oaks on that phase of the United Nations project, and then went to San Francisco and worked on that phase of the United Nations project in the summer of 1945. That's an extraordinary moment in time. It's a moment of time to think seriously about at this moment in time. He also, I think, fell in love with the San Francisco Bay Area and then stayed, briefly practicing law with a firm there, and then joining the law faculty at Stanford Law School. He was at Stanford and became a professor until 1962, when he was prevailed upon, recruited, unveiled, to become the dean of the University of Chicago Law School in his hometown. An extraordinary institution. I think you generally know, many of you are lawyers, what the University of Chicago Law School stands for, its place in American legal education, and part of that accomplishment is the generation in which Phil Neal presided over that school. He was the dean of the University of Chicago Law School for 13 years and a member of its faculty until 1983, at which point, life's long, why not have multiple careers? Phil Neal went back into private practice and was part of founding a firm that today bears his name first, Neal, Gerber, and Eisenberg, and actively practices a variety of law to this moment. I'm surprised he doesn't have a phone going off as we're here tonight. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Phil Neal, who was an extraordinary contributor to our discussion this afternoon. It's also a pleasure to introduce and to welcome Phil's wife, Linda Neal, herself an attorney in Chicago, herself quite a keen legal interrogator as we interviewed Phil, and we're gathering historical information, we're not taking depositions, but sometimes people don't exactly answer the question or leave an ambiguity in their answer, and in a historian's interview you might not jump on them. In an attorney's deposition you certainly would, and from over the shoulder there were a couple of occasions on which Linda said, "Is the implication this or that?" Or, "You didn't exactly answer his question." And so, I don't know if there's such a thing as pro bono counsel of the Robert H. Jackson Center, but Linda Neal has already performed that valuable role, and it's a pleasure to welcome her.
You're hired.
The second law clerk, who served as Jackson's only assistant, these were all solo law clerks, from the spring of 1945, when Phil Neal ditched the boss, until 2 summers later, is Murray Gartner. Murray is a native of New York City, a graduate of New York University. He too then became a student at Harvard Law School, and it sounds pedestrian to pile one after the next, he too became president of the Harvard Law Review. Robert Jackson was not a credential guy, but he was a substance and talent guy, and he also had a scout in the Harvard Law School, frankly. His son, William Eldred Jackson, was a classmate and friend and law review colleague of Phil Neal and Murray Gartner. And Bill Jackson played a role in facilitating the interviews and vouching for the quality and ultimately being a conduit to the clerkship, first of Phil and then of Murray Gartner. Murray's work for Jackson both included work for Jackson and absence from work by Jackson, because Murray's clerkship began in April of 1945, only a couple of weeks before an emissary, Sam Rosenman, on behalf of President Truman, came up to the court and officially asked Jackson to undertake a task that had been in the planning stages of President Roosevelt for some time, which was to begin and superintend and control the negotiation process among the Allies regarding what to do with the captured surviving Nazi leaders now that the war was virtually won. In other words, Nuremberg. And so Murray was hired, and then Jackson ditched the law clerk. During the year when Jackson was away from the court on the assignment that became the Nuremberg prosecution, Murray Gartner, I think, really did two jobs, although he's too modest to put it this way. He stayed in the trench doing the preparatory work, reviewing petitions, writing memos, and being poised to assist Jackson if Jackson had come back to, in a quick hitter session or on a full-time basis, resume his work as a justice, which was a prospect that loomed over that year. Jackson underestimated the length of time that Nuremberg would take and wished to get back, and knew that his colleagues wished to get him back, and heard that there were a lot of cases dividing 4-4 that needed him to get back. And Murray had all of that in great readiness, but Jackson never came back. Having an elbow, the other thing that Murray did was get grabbed by Felix Frankfurter and effectively became a deputized extra clerk in the Frankfurter chambers and worked closely with that extraordinary figure. And then at the end of the process in the summer of 1946, Jackson returned, and Murray Gartner continued to serve as his law clerk for the next term of the court. And so, in a particularly unique way, Murray knew Jackson before and after Nuremberg, and his remarks today were wonderful. Following his clerkship, Murray Gartner, classmate and friend and successor of Phil Neal, got the pitch about the Bay Area, and he too became a San Francisco lawyer for a period of time, but then returned to public service in another interesting, momentous moment. He went to Paris in 1950 and was there for a couple of years, working as one of the counsel on the Marshall Plan in the State Department. And so in terms of playing a role in the peace, as Phil did in the United Nations work, Murray did in the Marshall Plan work in Europe. Following that service, Murray returned to New York and became a very successful private practicing attorney, a partner in the Proskauer law firm, a very prominent, successful labor lawyer. On top of all that, Murray Gartner has devoted much energy and effort over the years to studying Robert Jackson. He too is deeply expert in this man and is part of the work that many of us are engaged in to understand, to study, to write, to promulgate the message of Robert Jackson. So it was a pleasure to have Murray Gartner in the roundtable today, and it's an honor to introduce him this evening. I'm also pleased to introduce Murray's son, Tom Gartner. Tom is here with him this evening, and Tom also is someone who got the Jackson bug. I look at my own young children, and frankly, they know a lot about Robert Jackson. As 11 and 8-year-olds go, I think they'll probably win that national exam right now. But it's a constructive thing with which to infect one's children. Tom Gartner knows an immense amount about Jackson, has worked with his father on the Jackson Project, and it's a pleasure to introduce him and have him here this evening. Our third guest is James M. Marsh. Jim Marsh is a native of northwestern Pennsylvania, the town of Brookville, where he graduated from high school, and then went to work in the 1930s in a series of positions that included a bunch of quotidian, and I mean that as a compliment, activities, selling automobiles, serving the public by taking on vast administrative responsibilities in the regional office of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a New Deal program that tried to keep people in their homes and succeeded during that time period. Some early work with lawyers, and immense responsibilities in each of those phases is part of what Jim Marsh did in his early years. He then, as the 30s ended and the war began, served our country for the full duration of the war in a series of stateside positions of immense responsibility. You can tell that Jim was one of the aces who made a lot of higher-ups look good in his military work. And that in itself is a skill. Jim Marsh, at the end of the war, wished to study the law. But you'll notice I haven't mentioned his college education because he didn't have one. He'd gone to the University of Life, and he had learned a vast amount from more than a decade in the University of Life, but he'd never gone to a college. And so it actually took a special petition and permission of the bar to let him enroll in law school at Temple University in Philadelphia, where Jim was an evening student while juggling responsibilities, work, and family during the day. He was a tremendous success as a student at Temple, and in his second year as an editor of the Temple Law Quarterly, developed an interest in the Nuremberg trial proceeding, which had begun with Jackson as the chief American prosecutor, and noted that although the popular press was doing a significant job reporting Nuremberg, the legal press, legal publications, legal academia generally weren't comparably performing. And so Jim Marsh, with a combination of foresight and chutzpah, wrote a letter to Robert H. Jackson at Nuremberg and told him what he'd observed and offered to publish Nuremberg-related materials in the Temple Law Quarterly. Jackson responded affirmatively, and so a series of issues in that journal, which Jim came to be the editor-in-chief of in the following year, published the full range of Nuremberg documents, from the appointment in Jackson's initial report to Truman, to the London Agreement, and on through the work till the closing report to Truman. At the end of all that, Robert Jackson is back on the Supreme Court, and Jim Marsh has graduated from law school, and he arranged to meet this man who had become, remove his pen pal and his hero, and went down to Washington, and while there, had one more moment of chutzpah and vision, and said, I would be very interested in being your law clerk. Robert Jackson clearly liked this kid a lot, and didn't say no, but needed to think about it. He told him to see if he could get some letters of recommendation, and Jim Marsh then triggered a letter-writing campaign that would knock your socks off, and it's in the Library of Congress. And as he commented today, he's read these letters in subsequent years. He claims not to recognize the guy, but it's a wonderful portrait of an extraordinarily accomplished person, despite the absence of a college degree. And so it took an evaluation process and a second meeting, but in the spring of 1947, Robert Jackson offered the job to Jim Marsh, who then promptly accepted and graduating from law school, moved himself and his young family to Washington and began to clerk for Jackson. A year was followed by an offer by Jackson to stay a second year, and so Jim was with Jackson from the summer of 47 until the summer of 49, 2 years as a clerk of that man. It's a pleasure to welcome Jim Marsh this evening. I've introduced Jim before telling the rest of his story because the risk of maybe breaking my time limit. I've got a couple more minutes that build at this point. Jim Marsh returned to Philadelphia, entered private practice, was a great success, specializing in appellate litigation. He's a quick thinker, he's a quick pen, he's a witty guy, he's a brilliant writer, and was a great success in his private practice. He also regularly undertook public sector assignments for the Pennsylvania court system. He was on Attorney General Robert Kennedy's commission that resulted in the first creation of federal public defenders in the early 1960s. And by the way, at the time he was going down to Justice and meeting with Bob Kennedy. Bob Kennedy worked in Bob Jackson's old office and lived in Bob Jackson's old house, Hickory Hill. So there must have been a Jackson aura and echo that struck Jim at that time period. Jim is here tonight with his family, and it's a pleasure to introduce them. I'll begin with his children. He's here with his daughters, Michelle and Fran, and his son, Jim Jr. I'm pleased to introduce them. And I'm also pleased to note that in the summer of 1942, Soldier Marsh, when Robert Jackson had only been on the court a year, got hitched. And 60 years later, he's accompanied tonight by his wife Antoinette, who's it's a very great pleasure to introduce. These gentlemen knew Robert Jackson in an intimate setting where all of him, his talent, his writing, his values, his character, were on display to them as few people ever got to see and know him. And that's what they related today. But they are also, in a larger sense, biographical of Robert H. Jackson. And I'd like to close by adding one more anecdote, maybe not even one that Jim Marsh knows. The hiring process by which Robert Jackson found his law clerks was quirky. Many justices had a picker or a feeder, a professor at a school who would send them a law clerk. Robert Jackson would go with an individual system that was sort of built on trust and relationship. Some of his early clerks came with the imprimatur of his own son, the Uber clerk, as I mentioned, whose advice he really leaned on throughout his life and valued to a great degree. But Robert Jackson was not just a blue chip talent, as you know. He was a great legal talent, but he was not a guy with awesome formal credentials. He never went to college. He went to Albany Law School for 1 year, covered 2 years of course material, but got to the law by apprenticing with a lawyer. He worked his way up, becoming the lawyer in Jamestown, but starting as the outsider lawyer in Jamestown. And what he found in his law clerks over his 13 years in the Supreme Court was a succession of young people who in different ways were him. That hit me like a hammer today as I sat there. I never got to meet Robert Jackson. I'm 7 years late on the birth date and so forth. And so the words, the witnesses, the colleagues are as close as I and we are able to get. But to sort of meet the law clerks and correlate it with what clicked in them for him is to know him in a powerful way. Which brings me to a document. Historians love documents, and this is one of my favorites. This document, written by Robert Jackson, is a photocopy of a piece of yellow legal paper, sideways, as you see. And it's a series of columns. Name, public service, college, religion, etc., experience, and then a last column doesn't even have a heading, but has some notes. And then it's got the names of 5 gentlemen who were the clerkship candidates he was evaluating in the spring of 1947. And I'll not tell you all of them, but one of them was clerking for Judge Stevens at the time, a prominent federal appellate judge. He was a graduate of George Washington University and Catholic law schools. He had some administrative experience. Another fellow was from Jamestown. He hadn't served a judge previously, but he'd been in the Navy. He had some scholarly achievements and so forth, and that's noted on the chart. A third fellow, Arlen Adams actually is his name, was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, a naval officer, editor-in-chief of the Penn Law Review, second in his class. Arlen Adams twice finished second, once with Nixon in the White House and once with Ford in the White House for a Supreme Court appointment himself, and went on to a very distinguished career as a judge in the Third Circuit, where I was a law clerk to one of his colleagues. And he's on this list. Another person, Arthur von Maren, was at the time Jackson made these notes, clerking for Learned Hand of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He was by ethnicity German. There's not much more you need to say about von Maren. An incredible talent, a brilliant guy, later a professor at Harvard Law School, a man who made a deep, significant mark in the legal academy. And the 5th name on the list is Marsh. Prior service, the column is blank. Religion, etc., the column is blank. Experience, the column is blank. College is the only column in the Marsh row that has an entry. And all it says there is none. Now here's the best part. This is the score sheet, right? Sometimes you have to tally up the score. And there are 3 numbers in circles. Carlson, the Jamestown boy, finished 3rd. Von Marin finished 2nd. And next to Marsh's name it says 1. It has a circle around